Snow clung stubbornly to the fence posts along the main road, the last of winter's grip refusing to release the valley. Jonah Hale rode into Red Hollow with his coat collar turned up against the wind, a bedroll tied behind his saddle, and a rifle resting in the worn leather scabbard. He had no plans to linger. The town was just another dot on his way west, another place to water the horse, buy a meal, and be gone before the sun dipped behind the ridge. But the sound of raised voices outside the saloon slowed his horse. Folks had gathered in a loose half-circle, their breath curling in the cold air. At the center stood a young woman, a thin, tattered shawl slipping from her shoulders. She was barefoot on the packed snow, toes red from the cold, and in her arms were 3 swaddled bundles. The babies made no sound, whether from sleep or shock, Jonah couldn't tell. Her cheek was swollen, one eye darkening to a bruise, and a thin line of blood traced the corner of her mouth. She didn't cry, didn't plead, only shifted her stance to hold the babies tighter against her chest. Around her, the murmurs cut sharp. 3 girls, someone muttered, not bothering to lower their voice. Worthless to the man, another said. Can't give him a son. The older couple standing behind her, her in-laws, Jonah guessed, looked at her the way a person might look at a stray dog that had followed too far. When the whispers grew bolder, they turned their backs and stepped away, as if their absence could erase the sight of her from the street. She stood alone then, the wind tugging at the loose ends of her hair. Jonah's horse shifted beneath him, sensing his hesitation. He could have kept riding. It wasn't his business. He had seen worse in towns like this, seen people turn away from suffering because it was easier than stepping into it. But something in the way she kept her chin level, even with her knees trembling, struck him like a hammer on steel. She didn't look beaten down, she looked braced, as if holding herself between the babies and a world that wanted to strip her bare. Jonah swung a leg over and stepped into the street, his boots crunching in the frozen dirt. The crowd parted just enough for him to pass. He stopped a few paces from her. Her gaze flicked to him, wary, measuring. You got somewhere to be, stranger, one of the men from the saloon called, a note of challenge in his voice. Jonah didn't answer him. He kept his eyes on her, lowering his voice so it carried only to where she stood. You're coming with me. Her grip on the babies didn't loosen, but her brow furrowed, as if weighing the risk of trusting one more man. Behind them, the in-laws paused, glancing back, but Jonah didn't give them the courtesy of a second look. He didn't offer his name, didn't explain himself. He only reached for the reins of her thin, shivering mule that stood tied to the post, the frayed rope barely knotted. She hesitated for a heartbeat, then stepped toward him, the crowd watching in tight-lipped silence. Jonah led her away from the saloon, away from the eyes that had already judged her, the crunch of his boots and the soft whimper of a baby the only sounds in the cold air. He didn't know where this road would take either of them, but he knew this much, he'd seen that look before, in the mirror and in the faces of the men who hadn't been saved. And he wasn't about to let her stand there in the snow 1 minute longer. The ride north out of Red Hollow was quiet, save for the wind threading through the pines and the creak of leather. The mare Jonah had given her led behind his horse, the quilt-wrapped bundles in her arms shifting only when one of the babies stirred. He hadn't asked her story. She hadn't offered it. There was a weight in the air between them, the kind that didn't beg to be broken with words. It wasn't until the trail narrowed along the ridge that she spoke, her voice low enough to nearly be lost in the wind. Mara. She didn't look at him, just said it like a fact, then glanced down at the bundles. Anna, Eliza, and Ruth. The names were small, soft things against the harsh edge of the land. Jonah nodded once. The quilt was worn thin in places, its squares mismatched, some faded calico, some stitched from what looked like old flour sacks. It had been mended so many times the thread itself seemed to tell a story. He noticed how her grip shifted when the wind cut sharper, as if shielding the babies from more than the cold. By the time they reached the cabin, the day had tilted toward evening. Smoke from the chimney twisted into the pale sky. Jonah swung down and opened the door, letting the heat from the banked fire spill into the cold. She stepped inside without hesitation, eyes flicking over the room in quick, deliberate sweeps: table, hearth, window, back wall. It was the way a person looked when they'd learned escape was something you measured in seconds. Jonah set water to warm and left her space, moving about the cabin with the quiet efficiency of someone used to his own company. She stayed by the fire, sitting straight-backed in the chair, the babies close against her. Even in the soft glow, he could see the edge in her posture, a refusal to sink into the seat, to let her guard drop. It was later, when the dark had pressed fully against the windows, that she began to speak. Not the whole of it, just pieces. How her husband's voice had turned cold after the first girl, how his family began to treat her as if she'd failed some unwritten duty. How, when the third girl came, the house that should have been hers felt more like a place she was borrowing. How the beating came one night without warning, the blows sharp and final in their meaning. She didn't cry while she spoke. Her voice didn't shake. But there were pauses, small, silent spaces where she seemed to measure what was safe to share. Jonah didn't fill them. He didn't tell her how the war had left him with more empty places than full ones, how the railroad had carved through his land without asking, how silence had become easier than company. Those things belonged to him the way her wounds belonged to her. Instead, he rose, placed another log on the fire, and draped his only blanket over the back of her chair before stepping away again. The fire popped, sending a curl of sparks upward. The babies slept in the crook of her arm, their breathing even. Mara's eyes followed Jonah for a moment, then returned to the flames. Neither of them spoke, but the room no longer felt like two strangers waiting for the other to leave. It felt, if only for a night, like a place where the wind couldn't get in. By the third morning, the sky had turned the color of pewter, clouds rolling low over the mountains, their swollen bellies ready to spill snow. The air had that brittle stillness that came before a storm, and Jonah moved with quiet urgency, pulling on his coat and heading to the barn to brace the roof beams against what was coming. Mara stayed inside, the babies bundled and drowsy, the fire holding its heat. She had just ladled a bit of broth into a tin cup when a sharp knock rattled the cabin door. It wasn't the kind of knock that asked permission, it demanded it. She froze for half a breath, then eased the babies deeper into their quilt before setting them in the cradle Jonah had dragged down from the loft. The second knock came harder, followed by voices, male, mocking. "Mara! Time to come home. You've been keeping what isn't yours long enough." Her fingers curled, the words sinking into her chest like ice. She crossed to the corner where Jonah kept his rifle. Her hands trembled as she lifted it, not from lack of strength, but from the knowledge of what it meant to hold such a thing. When she cracked the door, two men stood on the step, the snow at their feet just beginning to catch the first faint white flecks from the sky. They wore the smugness of men who believed they already owned the answer to whatever they asked. "Those babies belong to their family," one said, his eyes skimming the room behind her. "You know better than to hide them here." "They belong with me," Mara said, the barrel of the rifle steady enough, though her pulse thrummed in her ears. A gust of wind cut through, carrying the smell of hay and leather, and behind it came the sound of boots in the snow. Jonah stepped into the doorway as the first flake of the storm settled on his coat. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't put a hand on his gun. "You're leaving," he said simply. Something in his tone, low, even, certain, shifted the air between them. The two men exchanged a glance, weighing something invisible, then stepped back off the porch. Snow swirled around their boots as they turned, muttering, and made their way down the path. Jonah didn't watch them go for long. He shut the door against the wind, unbuttoned his coat, and hung it on the peg without a word. By nightfall, the storm had found its full strength. Snow battered the shutters, the wind's whistle slipping through the smallest gaps in the walls. The fire cracked and hissed, throwing a warm light that softened the edges of the room. Jonah brewed coffee in the tin pot, the smell mixing with the scent of wood smoke. He poured a cup for himself, then another for her, setting it on the table without looking for thanks. After a moment, he asked, "You told me their names before. Which one's which?" Mara glanced toward the cradle, her hand curling around the coffee cup. Anna's the quiet one. Eliza, she's the fighter. Ruth, she hesitated, her lips softening just enough to let the smallest smile slip through. Ruth is hungry all the time. It was the first time he'd seen her face break from its guarded stillness. The smile was quick, almost shy, but it left something behind in the air, something warmer than the fire, and quieter than the storm outside. The days found their rhythm without either of them deciding it should be so. Jonah split wood in the mornings, the steady thud of the axe marking time while the chimney sent a thin stream of smoke into the pale sky. Mara mended clothes at the table, her needle flashing in the firelight, the baby's small cries and coos rising between their tasks. The sound of tiny breaths and rustling blankets had become part of the cabin's walls, yet there was a weight beneath it all, something unspoken that neither dared to press against. Mara hated the feeling of taking without giving back. She cooked, cleaned, kept the fire fed, but in her chest she carried the sharp knowledge that none of this was hers, Jonah's cabin, Jonah's wood, Jonah's roof. She caught herself measuring his silences, wondering if they meant welcome or tolerance. Jonah, for his part, had grown accustomed to the solitude of years. The presence of another person, especially one who moved quietly but never faded from notice, left him unsettled in ways he hadn't expected. He found his eyes following her without meaning to, the way she paused over the cradle before turning away, the way her braid loosened by evening until strands framed her face, the way she held herself as if her pain was a private possession no one else was meant to see. It was near dusk when the soft crunch of snow announced a visitor. Jonah opened the door to reveal a tall man wrapped in a buffalo hide coat, his dark hair bound in two neat braids. Two feathers. They clasped forearms in greeting, the respect between them quiet but certain. Years ago, Jonah had stood beside his people in a skirmish the town pretended never happened, and the bond had held through the seasons since. Two feathers stepped inside, setting down a wrapped bundle of venison. His eyes rested on Mara, and when he spoke to her, his voice carried none of the hardness she'd grown used to from strangers. He asked if the babies were well, if she was warm enough. She answered softly, the stiffness in her shoulders easing as she realized his questions held no judgment. Jonah noticed the shift, the way her gaze lingered on two feathers a moment longer than on most. Kindness, she seemed to realize, could cross boundaries the town would never accept. When he left, the door closing behind him, the cabin felt different, fuller somehow, though the same silence settled back in. That night, Jonah sat at the table, oiling the stock of his rifle, while Mara stood at the window. Snow was falling on the ridge, the flakes catching in the last light before the sky turned fully to night. She rested one hand against the sill, her breath clouding the glass. The thaw would come soon enough, and with it, the question of whether she would remain. She could not read Jonah's thoughts, and perhaps he couldn't read his own, but the not knowing pressed against her ribs. The fire crackled behind her, the babies stirred in their sleep, and outside, the snow kept falling, quiet, steady, and without promise. The blizzard came without warning, rolling down from the high ridges in a wall of white that swallowed the valley. By mid-morning, the wind screamed through the chinks in the cabin walls, and snow piled against the door. Jonah kept the fire fed, but the heat seemed to vanish before it could reach the far corners of the room. When the smoke began to curl low and heavy from the stovepipe, he knew something was wrong. The draw was blocked. They couldn't stay inside, not with the air turning thick and the baby's breaths coming quick. Jonah pulled on his coat, grabbed the nearest blankets, and told Mara to wrap the girls tight. She didn't ask questions. Together they pushed out into the storm, snow stinging their faces, the wind tearing at the edges of the blankets. The barn was only 20 yards from the cabin, but it felt like a mile. Inside, the air was warmer, thick with the smell of hay and horses. Jonah led them to the far stall, where the draft was least. The lantern light flickered on the wooden beams, shadows swaying across their faces. Mara sat on a folded blanket, cradling one baby close while the others lay bundled beside her. Jonah checked the doors, wedging them shut against the wind. For a long while, they listened to the storm beat against the barn roof. Then, in a voice roughened by disuse, Jonah began to speak. Not all at once, just fragments, like stones dropped into deep water. About the brother he buried on a battlefield far from home. About the letters he wrote to his mother but never sent, because the words wouldn't make the distance any shorter. About the land he built a home on, only to watch the railroad stake it out for steel and ties. Mara said nothing, her hands rubbing warmth into the baby in her lap. She studied him in the shifting light, the way his eyes stayed on the floor as he spoke, the way he told it without asking for her sympathy. No one had ever stood between her and the world the way he had that day on the street, and no one had ever offered her the truth without trying to wrap it in pity. When the wind finally softened and the snow's voice dulled, they carried the babies back to the cabin. The air inside was cold but safe, the smoke gone. Jonah built the fire high again, and the glow began to push back the chill. Later, when the girls slept, Mara found his coat hanging by the door. A tear ran along the seam of one sleeve, the fabric frayed. She took it to the table, lit the lamp, and set to mending it with small, even stitches. Jonah watched from the hearth, silent, the firelight flickering across her bent head and the curve of her cheek. She didn't look up, and she didn't speak, but the sound of the needle pulling through cloth filled the space between them more completely than words could. It was the kind of quiet that didn't need breaking. The thaw came slowly, loosening the grip of winter one dripping eve at a time. The snow pulled back from the fence lines, and the earth showed through in dark, wet patches. With it came the kind of silence that felt like the land was holding its breath, until the sound of hooves broke it. Mara stepped onto the porch, the babies asleep inside, and saw them, her in-laws, 3 riders moving up the valley, their faces set and hard. Jonah was already in the yard, his hands resting loose at his sides. He didn't wait for them to dismount. The leader, a man whose mouth always seemed to curl around contempt, leaned in his saddle. "We're here for what's ours," he said. "The girls. And her." "They stay," Jonah answered, his voice even, carrying just enough to reach them without strain. "She stays. You ride out." The man gave a short laugh. "You think you can tell us?" The words died in his throat as another figure appeared on the ridge. 2 feathers, mounted on a bay mare, the bow in his hand strung and ready. He didn't call out. He didn't have to. The sight of him, the unspoken alliance, settled over the yard like a drawn curtain. The in-laws shifted in their saddles, glancing from Jonah to the ridge and back again. They weren't afraid of Jonah alone. They weren't afraid of 2 feathers alone. But together they understood there was no ground here they could claim. Without another word, they turned their horses. The sound of hooves faded down the valley, swallowed by the quiet of the thawing land. That afternoon, sunlight poured over the porch. Mara sat with the babies in her lap, the breeze teasing strands of hair from her braid. Jonah worked at the bridle, the leather creaking under his hands. The air between them felt different, not the cautious space of strangers, not the uneasy quiet of a truce, but something steady, something that didn't need testing. He didn't look at her when he spoke. "You're not going anywhere, unless you want to." The words settled over her like the warmth of the sun on her shoulders. She looked toward the road, the muddy ruts leading back toward town, and felt no pull. Behind her, the cabin walls held the scent of coffee and wood smoke. In front of her, the valley stretched wide and open. She stayed where she was, the babies shifting softly in her arms, Jonah's presence steady at her side. The thaw would finish, the seasons would turn, but this was the place she would stop leaving.